thank you very much, all of you. Just, I know we've met the two Andys, but just by way of a brief introduction, if I can just ask you to introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Lindsay. I live in Jersey. I've been there for 16 years. Before that, I was in the north of England. I grew up there. I am an accountant by trade and started my housing journey 12 years ago in Jersey when I joined the team at the Government of Jersey to create a new housing association, and that's what I've been doing since then.
Thank you. Hello, Gary Kermode. So I'm the Interim Director of Public Estates and Housing for the Department of Infrastructure. I had the privilege of supporting the housing team when I came into position 2 years ago, and it's been a revelation to me. So housing is quite new to me, but this is something I have to say I'm quite excited about, and listening to all the problems from the people I've met in housing, I think this is something that certainly has legs.
As you will all have noticed, I'm not the Chief Minister. My name's Laurie Hooper. I'm Minister for Health and Social Care.
Not yet.
I'm stepping in just on a temporary basis just to take questions from the floor. So good luck, everybody.
In jest, of course. Thank you, one and all. I'm going to come to you straight away, Gary. I've got to. Appreciate it's early days. We've just seen 5 options. What role do you envisage local authorities playing in this?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think, in fairness, I think we've built quite a good relationship with local authorities, certainly over the 2 years that I've been in post and what I've seen. The documents, the reports on housing associations go back an awful long way. And I think, to me, one of the reasons it hasn't taken shape is looking at the whole picture, trying to look at housing on the island as a single solution. So I really do think local authorities have a massive part to play in this. I think a step, if this was imposed as an island solution, would be way, way too far. There's masses of expertise out in local authorities, and this is about embracing that expertise and fueling and informing what could be a way to modernise housing on the Isle of Man. And I don't think anyone can deny that public sector stroke affordable housing needs modernising on the Isle of Man, especially in the times we're in now of such difficult fiscal times. So, yeah, for me, local authorities are key in the next step of this. One of the areas we did identify was, at this stage, should we go out to consultation? Should we widen this out? I'm talking to, looking at the reports, talking to people in the housing division. It was certainly obvious that the DOI stock could be a kickstart to this, and that would be a quick enabler. And one of the political drives, certainly from early this year, was we want something quick. We need to make action. We need to move forward. And this administration, I think, is saying that. Certainly the Chief Minister, it's one of his, in the themes yesterday and today is, let's move forward, let's do something. So this isn't about pushing local authorities out of this at all. This is about DOI taking a step into the swamp, an informed, consultative step on something that could be certainly a benefit and an advantage going forward. And
just on that front, have you got a preferred option personally, just having seen fairly recently what's in front of you?
I mean, preferred option? No, I don't have. Well, yeah, my preferred option would be a housing association involving all the experts in housing in the island. The reality is, for me, is to get something moving and to make sure it does work. I mean, we listen to experts, we look at other jurisdictions. There's worries about the financial modelling. There's worried about the rent control. So using DOI stock, 1,200 properties and something that we can control and manage, that to me has got to be the first step forward. So, yeah. Okay,
thank you. Laurie Hooper, there's talk of a housing crisis. What are your views?
Well, I think in a nutshell, we don't build enough houses. That's what it boils down to. We know that people struggle to afford to buy a house. We know that rent prices are quite high. We know that we're not building enough public sector housing. the reality is we have a supply and demand problem. There's a lot of demand out there for properties, both rental, purchase, affordable, whatever type of housing it is. And we just don't have enough. So the challenge we've got, I think, as a government is where does the public sector fit in to that model? You'll have heard from Enterprise talking about some of the infrastructure scheme investments that are coming forward. Those are predominantly residential. They're building homes for people. This is another way of dealing with that. Manx Development Corporation is doing its bit around brownfield redevelopment, Westmoreland Road, Nurses Home, key worker properties. This really is another piece of that puzzle that says, well, how do we make sure there is enough housing of the right type of housing for everybody on the island? And looking at a housing association model is part of that puzzle, part of that picture, I suppose.
Lindsay, how do you, with your background further afield, how do you see housing associations, how would they work on an island of this size and scale?
They work really well. A housing association really is just an entity that has a sole focus on delivering homes and looking after the people who live in them. That is their one focus, so that's different to government, who quite rightly has much wider focus, and housing, when it's part of the big government machine, is often the poor relative to health and education. But a housing association with the right governance to set the boundaries and to run it can deliver some really, really interesting housing solutions. It's not for profit, so it's always below market prices. It can be for rental, for sale. They can develop, so they can support the construction industry on the island as well. In practice, in Jersey, at least I can see it's worked really well, and the housing stock has improved, and we've also delivered a lot more new homes.
And Andy Chapman, from your perspective, is there any other ways, that, further to what Lindsay's just said, that they would help deliver in the communities?
So obviously we've got, Lindsay's talked about the sort of new units that can be delivered, so that develops communities, because you're getting more and more properties being built in communities, but it's working alongside communities. An association doesn't just do things on its own. It talks to its residents, it talks to the communities that people live in, and actually work out where the need is and what's needed. And also, it doesn't always just stop at housing. It can help with other things and just building up communities, see where there is, because it's all about demand. For having the demand there for your houses. So if there isn't a community there, people aren't going to want to live there. Therefore, why do you have housing in that area? So it is about building communities alongside provision of good quality housing. And I think this is the other thing. It brings hand in hand employment potentials with housing associations, because you've got more capital works being done, you've got new developments being done, and it's enhancing the economy and community as it goes along.
A collaboration then is needed. Consultation? Well, how do you envisage that unfolding? I appreciate this would be at arm's length, but just to get it going.
Well, to get it going, we've put together a budget and a project plan to move this to the next step. I think what we're trying to say here, and certainly what we're trying to put forward, is this isn't a done deal. We're not saying that we as DOI have made this decision and we're going to put DOI housing stock into a housing association. The report was about exploring the fundamentals of it. I mean, the politicians I've worked with in the last 2 years that have been impacted by housing have all demonstrated it needs to change. This year, the Housing Association model came to the front. I think it was through a British-Irish council that sort of primed the Chief Minister and the DOI Minister at the time, Minister Thomas. And that sort of fueled us re-looking at housing associations. When we picked up the old documents, it's nothing new. The Isle of Man has explored it for the last 12 years. We just haven't grabbed it. So for us, it was about how do we get from where we are to where we need to be. So yes, we engaged Dave Tolson Partnership because they've got a good history of the Isle of Man. We put together a structure how we think it might work, but this is all a lot of assumption. This is all very much paperwork. The next step is to look at the reality of that. How does that actually factor in? And of course, the consultation. We know there's some really mature very capable, well-organised local authorities delivering good quality housing. We know there's some local authorities who are probably struggling with some of their stock.
Well, let me bring in a first question from the floor here, actually. Is the vision, how will the government continue to support development of housing for local authorities? Is the vision that the association would become the primary delivery mechanism for new affordable housing in the island, and the authority remains existing stock? Was that on the radar too?
That is not on the radar. I mean, that's down the road, depending on the housing association, if it was engaged, and how that would mature. And really whether it functions in its own right and meets the requirements which the Andes have highlighted. You know, one of the advantages was it would be dynamic, it would be flexible, it would be able to meet the demands of the day. That doesn't mean it's got to do the whole Isle of Man's housing, but all the issues that the working groups have been on over the past 2 years, we can't deliver the solutions. Homelessness, care workers leaving, key workers coming in. There's a whole myriad of housing issues which we are just not tooled to deal with. If we had a housing association with sufficient stock that had the ability to loan, to change, to repurpose, I mean, property is property. It doesn't really matter who's in it. We can meet the requirements of the time. There might not be a homelessness issue today. There might be a high one tomorrow. There might be not in the future. There might be a key worker issue next year. We can change and we can readdress the property to meet the needs. So I've forgotten the thread of the question,
No.
but even if it just stayed with that stock, I think it's got enough financial capacity, given what's being looked at, to develop, to produce more housing and to meet wider needs.
Okay. All right. Minister, the options report, I think, is due to go before Tynwald next month. A lot of people hearing about this initiative, 48 hours or so ago, will be thinking immediately, any subsidised packages for young families, first-time buyers? What about the support for the vulnerable, the elderly, the homeless, those leaving the care system? What are your thoughts on that?
So at the moment, most of that stuff is actually dealt with through DOI schemes anyway. So the first-time buyer scheme, for example, the shared equity purchase scheme exists. At the moment, I'm not aware of any suggestions that should change.
Right.
In fact, I'm quite keen to explore other options and other models. So government-backed mortgage guarantees, for example. There are loads of things we could be doing as a government to provide better support for people. Care leaver accommodation is another really good example. There is a definite gap where we don't have enough of that on the island. The question is how best to go ahead and deliver it. So what we're talking about here in respect of a housing association is about a structure, not necessarily everything else that goes with it. There's no reason why, for example, a housing association couldn't provide sheltered accommodation, extra care accommodation, care leaver accommodation. There's no reason why they couldn't offer their own rent-to-buy packages, for example. So it gives you some flexibility in terms of then pushing additional different types of government policy, especially in areas where at the moment we're not really, like Gary says, we're not tooled to do some of this stuff currently, but actually maybe we could be if we get the structures right.
Andy Roskell, I'm going to put this question to you. It's come in from the floor. Why were the UK or Jersey used as models to emulate when their housing crisis is as bad, if not worse, than ours?
Sorry, can you just ask?
Yes, certainly. Why were the UK or Jersey, why have they been used as models, comparables to emulate when their housing crisis is as bad, if not worse, than ours on the island?
No, it's a good question. The housing crisis is affecting the island, Scotland, Wales and England as well. The reasons behind that go back many years and they're absolutely myriad, and I think it's fair to say that all housing providers in all jurisdictions are working as hard as they can to address those points in different ways. Certainly in the UK, local authorities with council housing, we can see they're under massive pressure. We know about the problems at Birmingham, not just in relation to the housing stock, of which they have a very large portfolio, but other issues as well. And the local authority obviously has massive sort of range of services that it needs to provide from its finite resources. So that's one housing provider, obviously. Then we've got in the UK, in England, we've got arm's length management organisations, which were set up during the phase of massive stock transfers of local authorities. Those ALMOs were set up, arm's length management organisations, with less funding than was available to the housing stock transfers, who were able to secure funds from the private markets, but nevertheless did quite a good job. But many of those have actually started to be taken back in by local authorities who were going to retain that stock. And then we've got housing providers, social housing providers, housing associations, and with private landlords as well. I think it's fair to say that in a difficult climate for everybody in the whole sort of UK, if you like, and the Crown dependencies in terms of economy and other challenges and things like that, I think there's actually a very good track record of housing providers, housing associations, I would say in particular, who use their borrowing leverage to actually invest in their existing properties, but also to build new properties as well. And I think over the years they've done a pretty good job at doing that, albeit often subsidised by grants, but nonetheless they've built a lot of stock of pretty good quality, really. So I think they would say more government subsidy would be useful to actually enable more property to be built. But that's a sort of wider political point, really.
You closer to home, perhaps for the Minister or Gary, this has just popped in. Why build more properties? Why not move forward? It's an age-old question. Why not move forward, moving all tenants onto fixed-term tenancies, which should encourage higher earners out of public sector housing and into other schemes? Simple.
So I spent 5 years on the Housing Committee and Ramsey Commissioners, and actually the number of people who probably don't qualify for housing is so small that the reality is fixed-term tenancies are probably a good idea to help the churn, to help encourage people to make choices themselves, actually, when it's good for them to move on. But the reality is that this myth that exists, that there are significant numbers of people in the public sector housing stock who are earning well above the thresholds, it really isn't the case. I think when we brought in the first round of fixed-term tenancies, as far as I'm aware, I asked some Tynwald questions about this a few years ago, and I think there were 3 families, that moved out of homes as a result. The numbers are so infinitesimally small. The reality is, yes, it's probably a good idea to do for lots of other reasons, but it isn't the panacea that's suddenly going to solve your housing problem.
Lindsay, from your personal experience, is the structure of, and I appreciate this is off island, is the structure of how social housing is managed the problem, or is the housing stock or the lack of housing stock the problem?
I think you have to get both of those things right. I think if you ask people to leave social housing to go to the private sector, they've got to have somewhere to go. And quite often these can be people who are lifelong renters. And the private sector doesn't serve those as well as a social sector. And what was the other aspect? The number of homes?
Yes.
Yeah, the number of homes, that's a huge impact. I mean, Jersey does have a high cost of living and also has troubles with affordability. The housing association that we created is building new homes, and that has a positive impact on that. But it does take time to deliver them. But ultimately, if you want the homes to be more affordable, you've got to deliver more so that the supply and demand is more balanced. So I think the supply of homes is really a crucial aspect.
I appreciate, again, we're talking very much in its infancy here, these proposals, these options. But a question has come in, Gary, which I'll put to you. What are the timescales anticipated for the implementation of this?
So initially,
Have you got a rough guide?
Well, yeah. Well, initially we looked at obviously going strong. We looked at quite a high-level budget, and we looked at if the will was there, we could take this to an implementation level, and we were probably looking at around 24 months. We've broken that down now more to do the consultative process first, do the wider review, do some deep dives into the actual implications of this. Now, that time scale, we are probably, well, that's a good question. It's something I haven't really factored in. We would hope to have something in play around April time. It will all depend the people, the resource that we can get, and of course the budget that we'll need to do it. But to drive this forward, we don't want to be, again, revisiting, re-looking, re-examining some of the obvious points. We just need to get it to a place where Absolutely, we've consulted. Absolutely, we've looked at the other options and what the other local authorities' views on it. We've got a full picture, both financial, both legislative, how we're going to manage the housing authority, the governance principles around it, so it's ready to go. I think if we push this too far, the momentum's gone, the decision-making will be gone, and we'll be doing this in another 5 years.
You mentioned local authorities there. Was there any consultation, meetings with local authorities when this research was being conducted? Either of you, chaps, Andy and Andy?
In terms of the our analysis, we considered that with the DOI at the outset, and we discussed it with the Minister of Infrastructure at the time, and we effectively progressed the options with a relatively limited amount of consultation, but with a clear view that as the options were analysed and they emerged in a coherent detail, if you like, in terms of a report, that will be the best opportunity to engage with a sort of emerging case for wider consultation, which we think is really important.
There's more to come. Minister, would you say there is potential conflict between this new initiative and the Manx Development Corporation, or will they work well? And if so, how will they work together?
No, I think they do sort of go hand in hand. The Development Corporation's remit is predominantly the redevelopment of brownfield sites. So their main focus is actually taking sites that are not currently in use and bringing them back to life. A big part of that focus is on the development of residential property. That's a big piece of the work they do. I don't think the Development Corporation as a body has a lot of interest then in running and managing and operating those houses. That's not really part of their remit. So I can envisage a situation where the Development Corporation does a lot of the building and the development work, but then actually management of property is transferred then over to whether it be a housing association, a local authority, or the DOI, or whatever the model is. I don't think the long-term vision for MDC is that it should be operating and acting as a landlord. That's much better done by people who actually have a lot of expertise in that area.
So a property is going to be built where the demand is, or where there is land that's more freely available, if I can put it that way?
So at present, MDC's remit is to look predominantly at government-owned sites. That's the focus and the nucleus of what they do. So predominantly then that's going to be areas around Douglas for the most part, where a lot of government land is owned. I don't really see there's any conflict in between developing where land is available, where the strategic plan says we should be developing, and where people want to buy houses. Invariably, there is a big overlap there between where people want to live and where you need to build houses. And it, again, depends on the type of housing you're talking about. In Ramsey, for example, we could do with some more bungalows. Perhaps we don't need lots of two-bed flats. Douglas may need a lot of two-bed flats, but not as many bungalows. It depends on the exact need and what it is people are trying to buy, because ultimately the end result of this is you want to put people in the properties. This is all about people at the end of the day. So if you're building the wrong type of properties in the wrong location, you're not going to get tenants, you're not going to get people buying those properties.
Can I ask either or both of our two guests on the far side there, how does our public sector ratio compare to other jurisdictions as a percentage?
In terms of the public ownership of stock?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
I suppose it's here it's more significant than in either Wales, Scotland or England, because over the years there's been a gradual transfer of ownership of the stock. So it is a higher percentage, yeah.
Okay, and this question is, please can the two Andys give examples of what they mean by non-housing related assets?
It depends what's wanted to be transferred. So a non-housing related asset in previous stock transfers, and I've got experience of working on about 70 over the long period of time that I've been a management consultant, but things such as shops that may be below flats and stuff like that, or garage sites that come along with the housing stock. They're the sort of non-housing assets that we're talking about. But it just depends on what's agreed in terms of the transfer, if there is a transfer of what the government want to transfer across this new body. But certainly there's certain things, as I say, shops, if they're underneath the flat and there's a freehold, it's usually that those shops would possibly transfer, or there would be an arrangement that there'd be some sort of flying freehold or something like that.
I want to ask a couple more questions from Slido, and then we'll open to the floor. This one's actually come straight into you, Minister. The Isle of Man experience to date with the development of boards is that industry experts do not exist locally and are hard to recruit to NED positions. Fair comment?
I think it depends what you're looking for. So in some cases, I think that's probably true. When we set up the agency model inside the Department for Enterprise, for example, we actually had a roaring success in recruiting local, experienced people from the right industries, the right sectors, the right backgrounds to sit on those boards and act as executive and non-executive members. So I think that works really well. In some other areas where you are looking at more of a specialism, it can be more difficult. I think that's the nature of it being a small island. In this case, though, I think, like Gary's already talked about, there is a lot of housing expertise on the Isle of Man. There are lots of local authorities that already do this and do it really well. There's lots of staff in those organisations that do this and do it really well. So I'm not as worried, I think, in terms of being able to find the right people for a board for housing than I would be if I was doing something, for example, in the health service. I think when it comes to housing delivery, we probably do have a lot of really experienced people that would be able to add a lot of value.
And just going back to option 2, Gary, within the report, the option, this member of the public says, uses the assumption other local authorities will simply transfer their owned assets into the new housing association, essentially free of charge. Potentially, we touched on that with the potential debt that you take on as well with some. Do you think that is a feasible or realistic assumption, this listener's asking?
I mean, that's what this process will highlight once we do the further discussions with the local authorities. What we're trying to avoid is diving into every one of the 5 options. So the consultative process will bring out possibly enhanced information on the options that are presented, and that's really from the local authorities that may wish to come in or may wish to look at different models and working models. What we don't want to do is do that for everyone. I think if we do that, we're now into probably 24 months of investigation and revisiting, and we won't get anywhere. For me, I think you've also got to tie into this. I mean, nobody's not seeing the DOI is too big. The DOI really needs to be split out. Core roles of the DOI. Housing has been discussed. I've been in government for many, many years, far more years than I'd like to say. But when I've come into the DOI, housing was always discussed. And I think this is a negative because sections are under review and there's always this talk about how they might change or morph. We get stifled in development, we get stifled in resource, we start to reduce, we change what we do, we change what we deliver. This is where option 1 with DOI stock actually falls into the review that the Chief Minister is doing into DOI. DOI housing has to be looked at. To take it as it stands and drop it somewhere else is not going to make an improvement. It's not going to make any savings. In fact, it's going to make things worse. So if you're going to review DOI housing, then why not review it under this housing association model? Why not take this opportunity to look at the advantages that come with that and open that to wider consultation? So there's two elements to this. This isn't just about we want a rough shot over, we've decided to put this in place and then we'll put requirements around local authorities and force them in. This is also about the need for change that's been on the agenda for many years. It's now at the top of the agenda. So it's about meeting that, and to me it's prime opportunity to do it right and do it properly, not just take it and move it.
Okay, well let's take it and move it. We have a few hands up already. We have a colleague or two with roving mics. I think the race is on to see who'll get to the front left or the front right first. And I think we're going to go to the Dean. Yes, thank you, sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm Technical Director of the Events Sustainable Limited. I've lived on the island, worked on the island for over 40 years. Prior to that, I spent 20 of years working in the UK. Effectively, in the late 1970s, early 80s, I co-founded an experimental housing and building association as a public using as a cooperative, effectively, working with Professor Taylor, a sociologist, and just looking at what the potential of such a concept was. We learned an enormous amount of what not to do. And listening to you today, you've got many options there, but the critical option is we have to look at the local ability of the people, the way they are this. I mean, certainly, what was interesting, we actually, as part of what we did, we looked at establishing a cooperative housing association on the island, and we used the Isle of Man as a test bed for what we were looking at. And effectively, what we came up with was the fact that it was critical that there was two-stage management. Because you have to, if you don't engage with your tenants or members, you've got a problem. So basically, you have core professional management and you have second-tier management made up from people brought in from the tenants or of the tenants or members of the live in the properties that are owned by the housing association. That concept worked incredibly well. Although financially the cooperative was not a success, certainly what it achieved, I mean, many of the people moved on in various areas of politics, etc., and they took that, a lot of them were very left-wing, and they gave them an understanding of what business was about, and what the difficulties of running a business that they really weren't engaging with.
Can I ask for your questions, sir, to any of the panellists?
The question is that effectively, I believe that we need to establish a housing association in Ireland as a social enterprise scheme on whatever level as a cooperative, as a not-for-profit organisation. Critical to that would be the potential for tenants to buy from the association one of the property they live in at a price which was set below market level to make it affordable to them. That would then enable the association to have funding from that. It would also enable potential tenants to effectively build equity, which they could potentially then move with into the private sector later on. Now, towards the sort of the actual construction of houses is pretty important. We probably much rare we built in not quite much here. A pair of the most secular properties in the British Isles, effectively. I mean, we've had them, I've lived in there with my family for a year. Energy usage the entire year for heating, hot water and everything use was £372. Right? Now, we're currently working with private clients looking at how we can extend, such a sustainable concept affordably into existing properties. We work very closely with the Andium, who is the co-founder of this society. They are currently building properties in Sweden which achieve or exceed carbon neutral.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure some of the panellists would be more than happy to have a chat with you once we finished in about 10 minutes' time as well, because I think there's more to explore there. But I just want to ask, Lindsay, your view first, and then perhaps the Minister for your reaction.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's absolutely vital that the people who are using the homes have a voice, whether that's they're part of the board or there's regular consultation or they are part of the employment, absolutely vital. If we don't listen to our clients and actively seek out what it is they want and what they value, then we're just wasting our money providing services that they may not want. I also completely agree that there should be choice. If you're renting and you want to buy, and there is a way that the association can help you by providing some sort of subsidised purchase option, then that is a positive step forward. And there are ways to do that without cheating the market as well, by deferring parts of the purchase price and allowing that deferred element to sit as a second charge on the property. I completely agree with what you've put forward, as well as the options for carbon neutral. As a housing association, using its scale, can look at modern methods of construction, which can help develop the construction industry, passive house, with some scale. And without the need to make a profit, there's plenty of options there.
And Laurie Hooper?
Yeah, I think, you make some interesting points. I think the one thing I'd be nervous about going down a route that says the housing association would be able to do more things than, say, other public authorities could do is you risk creating a type of a two-tier system, which was alluded to before by James in one of his questions, whereby tenants of a housing authority would be able to purchase their property, but tenants of a local authority property wouldn't, and yet they're all subject to the same rules, the same restrictions and requirements. So I think, in principle, I think what you're advocating makes a lot of sense. You want tenants to be involved, you want tenants to have choice, you want people to be able to buy their own homes at an affordable rate, and you want the system to be financially sustainable. But I'd be nervous about inadvertently creating a two-tier or twin-track system where, if we are going to have a model that says local authorities will continue to play an important role, we don't want to minimise that in any way by saying, well, actually, we aren't going to make sure you're included in some of these things. And so if you are looking at saying, for example, tenants must be represented on some of these boards, that would be great. But then if local authorities don't do the same thing, you do end up creating a bit of a disparity and imbalance. And I know some local authorities already do have tenant representatives on their housing committees, but I don't think that's true of all of them. And so you are running the risk there, I think, of inadvertently prioritising or giving preferential position to your new housing association over the existing model. That may not be where we end up. It may be that all the local authorities decide they really want to be a part of this, and it all moves forward in that way. Or it could be that Tynwald says, no, we're quite happy with the status quo, in which case we'll have to look at other options. But you make some really good points, but I think placing them in that local context is quite important.
Thank you for your question. Lady here, Diane, yes.
Thanks very much, panel. First of all, I wanted to say I am very supportive of us modernising the way we deal with our either social or, more importantly, government-owned or publicly owned property. So this is not from a negative perspective. And when I saw your paper a couple of days ago, I was saying, let's get on with it. The only problem I have is I'm an ex-Ministry of Defence tenant for 23 years. And essentially in 1996, Annington Homes bought or were given, I don't know, I think it's this transfer that concerns me. And given the judicial review that happened in May this year, whereby Guy Hands and Annington Homes had to sell back, or the MOD got the right to buy back their properties, can we make sure, and you don't have to answer it now, but can we make sure that that is included in the consideration when we're handing over some very valuable assets that, even if it's not for profit, there still might be an awful lot of profit being made by individuals in the process? Thank you.
So I think when looking at that, we'd probably have to look at the structure in which this organisation is set up. My personal view is it would have to be a legislative instrument, because if you're looking at transferring 1,200 properties from one owner to another, that would be extremely time-consuming and complex if you did that through the normal property transfer process, in which case you're looking at a very similar process to when we set up Manx Care, in which case the government still would own the organisation in one way or another. And so ultimately it's transferring as if we were transferring from one government department to another. The taxpayer would still ultimately have ownership and control over the organisation. I don't think anybody, at least I've not seen in those options, it being talked about that this should go out with public ownership, and that assets and the value of assets should be transferred entirely out of the government, entirely out of the taxpayer's control. I don't think that's what's being talked about.
Andy Roskell, your take on that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a fantastic point. Absolutely right. These are very valuable assets that you need to take care of the future of them. If you know, following consultation, it is decided that it's worth progressing one of these options, option one potentially, then there needs to be great care and due diligence about the process of actually preparing that sort of transfer agreement that I talked about, and the content of that will actually help you to enshrine within that what you do want, and we've got objectives already established, and what you don't want.
Thank you for the question. I saw one, possibly two hands, certainly one. We'll make this, two more questions then. Peter, first of all, thank you.
If you give the DOI stock to a housing association, it may work fine from a financial point of view for them. It doesn't mean that it'll work for local authority stock, because loan charges are a huge proportion of what the rents are spent on. So I'd be wary of making a decision based upon the DOI, because it won't necessarily work for all. My question is, what can a housing association do that the DOI or the local authorities can't?
It's the multi-million-dollar question.
Well, in my inexperienced and short career in housing, what the DOI can't. The DOI does a fantastic job and the team deliver a very, very good service. But what I've experienced over these 2 years is we can do everything, but in the structure of government, it is very, very, very slow. And it doesn't meet today's demands. By the time we've moved and we've delivered, the world has moved. We haven't solved the problem. We're faced with another problem. And the team are so diverted by the number of pressures and problems on them that it's quite stifling. For me, I see the Housing Association as the ability to work more commercially, more dynamically, more versatilely, but with an oversight and a structure in place to make sure that it doesn't go off on any tangents. So I have a massive respect for what the team do, but I'm very frustrated by what we can do in the time. It is very slow. But that's government, and it has to be that. That's not a criticism of government. It has to have its checks and balances in.
Laurie, quick response, and then Lindsay.
I think the key thing really is about the additionality. So there's some Douglas councillors in the audience, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but Douglas has some of the oldest housing stock on the island. Douglas is spending a lot of money refurbishing, redoing its existing housing stock. Ramsey's doing the same, so a lot of the work going on in Ramsey around housing is refurbishing the existing stock or replacing out of date, out of assets that aren't fit for purpose. They're not really building extra properties, because they don't have the resources, they can't do everything. And so what can a housing association do that the government or local authorities can't do is they can focus on building new properties rather than necessarily having to spend all of their energy bringing their current stock up to date. Now, no doubt in the next 10 years or so, when all that stuff is finished, local authorities will be able to focus on building additional properties, but at the moment that really isn't their focus, and the reality is we need additional housing now. We can't afford to wait for all the existing stock to be refurbished and rebuilt before we can start looking at building additional properties or refurbishing brownfield sites into additional units.
Lindsay, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to add that it's a really difficult question to answer logically, because logically a housing association and the government, there's nothing that one or the other couldn't do. But in practice, it's that focus. The housing association has a complete focus on housing, and it just in practice is better typically at delivering the housing solutions and getting on and building things. But although a lot of things change when a housing association is put in place, a lot of things stay the same as well. And it might be the same people transferring over from one to the other. It's not necessarily a new team of people coming in from the UK. It's probably a lot of people from that department transferring over, and but just with a funding model and a business model that wraps around it, that means that that dedicated team of people can say yes when they are asked, can we have a new kitchen, have you got any new properties? They just actually have more tools to be able to actually offer the solutions.
Thank you. We are out of time, but we're just going to get one more question in. I promised. Yes, David.
Yeah. James, you know who I am. Can I ask the panel, and the last lady's question is, you said that local government could do the same as a housing authority, right, or the housing board. So why, in your opinion, you don't live here, I presume, why do you think the government has not done something about it? That's one question. The other question is regarding the guy that's done the evaluation from the Tolson group there. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a local authority member. I've never seen anything from you regarding us. Only a few years ago, that was about 10 years ago, you sent something when we were in government at the time, and that fell on deaf ears. And could I ask, James, the political question is, government is sitting on land already in the Douglas area. There's the bus station, you failed miserably on that. The Summerland site, I don't believe housing is going to go on that. You failed miserably on that. You've also got Park Road. There were plans when I left government, that was 2015.
What's the question?
The question is, why haven't you done something? All these, including the guy from housing who says he must be living in cuckoo land if you think the local authorities are going to give you the houses.
No. Oh, David, thank you. I don't expect you to answer that question, because you couldn't possibly know, with respect, what's gone over the last 6 years on the Isle of Man. So I wouldn't put you in that position. But I don't know if Laurie or Garrett, one of you wants to take that last question from David before we wrap it up.
Partly it's about focus, I think. So Park Road is a particular site. Education have got a need for schools. Are they going to build a school on it? Yes or no? That's a question that I think needs to be answered. Summerland, much more complicated, actually, in terms of getting that site ready. I know the Development Corporation have looked at a range of sites in terms of what they can do, but actually redeveloping those existing brownfield sites is a focus of the Development Corporation, and in the 2 years since that's been established, they are actually making some quite significant progress on things that have been untouched for decades, which is why we set them up in the first place, actually, because government hadn't made progress. And I'm going to say this because I keep telling people this whenever they ask me the question, why has government not done more of this stuff? It's because our political system does not encourage longer term thinking. You elect independents, they're only really then interested in the next election. There is no continuity of government here. So every decision that's made is almost a consensus, a compromise agreement. So you don't get big, bold decision making. And that's not the government necessarily, that's Tynwald that almost prevents some of this stuff. And I've said this a number of times recently when people have talked to me about issues in the health service, for example, or issues elsewhere. Government isn't the blocker. 9 times out of 10, the blocker is when you try and take things through Tynwald through that parliamentary process, that you end up with things getting more complicated and end up with roadblocks being placed in the way. So really, this is why when Gary talks about this not being a done deal, it very much is not a done deal. This very much is a process of consultation, of engagement, of getting a broad base of support to take this through, because if we don't get a broad base of support from Tynwald members, this isn't going to happen, irrespective of whether it is the best thing since sliced bread or not. Ultimately, we have to build that consensus arrangement, and that is the only way we're going to get this done. It's very difficult to do that in a short time frame, but that is definitely the aim.
And I know Minister Hooper, I'm sure I speak for him when he said he'd probably be happy to stay till at least 11 o'clock tonight to talk this through with you a little bit further on. Thank you for your question.